All right, so let's talk about trade barriers, the ways that if you wanted to, you'll go about restricting trade. So as we've already talked about, trade is a positive sum activity. Both A and B, right? Both trading partners benefit from engaging in trade. It's a positive sum activity. It's not a zero sum game where somebody wins at the cost of somebody else, right? Somebody doesn't have to win and somebody else lose. You don't have to have the loss to get the win. You can both win. In fact, trade, as long as it's free and voluntary, just like at the domestic level, international trade means that both partners win at the same time. We know that trade improves national wealth and growth. Right, this has been shown over and over again. And that, in fact, simply trading, exchanging with a country is often the best way to help that country grow. Trying to give that country money, trying to help that country build infrastructure, trying to help that country set up their courts or anything else. Those can be helpful. Sometimes they're actually harmful, but the best thing over and over again is simply to trade with them. Trade allows better specialization. Workers become more productive because they can focus on things that they're better at and buy the things they're worse at from somebody else. Customers have access to lower prices as the products are made by people who are more efficient at making them here or abroad. It causes the prices of everything to go down. And yes, there are some hesitations to trade. We talked about them in a previous video. Right? You might be worried about security. You might be worried about, bad actors in foreign governments. You might be worried about safety. You might be worried about jobs. And some of these have a grain of truth. Not the jobs one, but the rest of them. They have a little bit of a grain of truth, but only just that. And it's often overblown. There's often a cheaper, easier way to achieve your objective than by restricting trade. But what if you still want to restrict or limit trade? Restrict, limit, or distort trade. This might be because of politics, right? There might be some diplomatic purpose for wanting to restrict trade. You might want to try to cause a foreign government to bend to your will in some way or for some reason. Perhaps you just are economically ignorant. You don't know what you're talking about, or you are malfeasant in some way. You want to try to harm your country. Perhaps you're engaged in warfare by other means, right? Here we have military sanctions. And this is very much related to the diplomacy angle up here also. All right, but say you want to restrict, limit, or distort trade. How do you go about doing it? Well, there are 4 ways. And these 4 ways encompass all other subcategories of ways to restrict trade. So the 4 main ways to restrict trade are tariffs, quotas, regulations, and subsidies. Tariffs, quotas, regulations, and subsidies. And we'll deal with them all, but just quickly to give you a little bit of a sneak preview. Tariffs are essentially taxes charged on the importation of goods. Quotas are restrictions on the quantity of goods that you can import. Regulations, that's the broad term that goes to indicate red tape, hoops that the importer or the foreign manufacturer has to jump through to bring those foreign-made goods into U.S. stores. Subsidies, this one's a little bit different. We'll talk about how exactly, but subsidies deal with providing money to domestic suppliers so they're more willing and more able to compete with the foreign manufacturers. Let's talk about tariffs to start with. All right, so tariffs, as I mentioned above, are essentially a tax on the importation of a good. This isn't terribly complex. It's a legally incident tax on the importation of the good. So the person who imports the good, whether it's the foreign supplier directly or their stateside partner, right? This person who imports the good, the person who brings the good in through customs, has to pay this tax. Now, what does this do? Well, effectively, it increases the price. Right. Effectively, it increases the price, meaning that now there's an increased sticker price at which the foreign supplier is willing to offer that good for sale on the U.S. market. Now, yes, everything we've talked about with regard to taxes still applies. That tariff that is placed legally incident on the importer, they don't bear the full economic incidence of it. They'll pass some of that on to the customer. Right? The customer sees that as an increase in prices. And that's all we care about now. Right? As far as the domestic implications of a tariff, that's all that we care about. Yes, to some extent it hurts the foreign suppliers. It hurts the domestic market actually more. And I'll show you why. But we have the economically incident portion of that tariff, of that tax, that bears on the consumers is perceived as an increase in prices, because that's what it is exactly. All right, so here we have a domestic supply curve. Here we have a domestic demand curve. Here we have the world price. We'll call this price world. Let's go and blow this up a bit so we can see what's going on here. So here's the world price. And the world price is the price at which foreign suppliers are willing to supply this good. That's why there's an import. So the world price being here, this becomes the maximum that American suppliers can also supply at. So here we go. We have quantity supplied. So that's domestic quantities supplied. Right? Domestic quantity supplied, or quantity supplied by domestic suppliers. Because remember, the supply curve is the domestic supply curve. So here you have cost to the domestic suppliers. Here you have profit for the domestic suppliers. Here you have the quantity that the domestic consumers, right, that American consumers wish to purchase of this good. But there's a problem, right? You can see the problem here. What's this? Well, normally this would be a shortage. When the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied at a particular price either rises or you have a shortage. But remember, we're talking about international market here. And so this here becomes your import. Got it? Okay, now, this is what a normal import market looks like. There's some quantity of domestic supply. Oh yeah, domestic producers would love to produce here, right, at this price. And this is the price, in fact, that you would have to pay if there was no international trade. And yeah, there would be this quantity here if there was no international trade. But international trade allows us to have a lower price, as I talked about before, right? One of the advantages of international trade is that consumers have a lower price, so they have more money to spend on other things. Consumer surplus, instead of just being this little area here, it's this whole massive triangle. There's a lot more consumer surplus with trade than there otherwise would be. Consumers do very well with international trade. So this is what the market looks like when there's international trade. There is domestic production, maybe it's specialty goods, maybe it's the most efficient domestic suppliers, whatever. There then is additional imports, additional quantity imported to fill the gap between quantity supplied at that world price and quantity demanded at the world price. Now, the world price, of course, accounts for transportation costs. And importantly for us, it accounts for tariffs. See, if we take a tariff and we put a tariff in this market, oh, that's just a terrible line. Let's get rid of that. Put a tariff in this market here. That's good enough. We're going to call this PT. I'm going to zoom this in again a little bit here. So here's our tariff now. And this tariff is showing as an increase in prices, because that's exactly what it is. So what happens? Well, the apparent international price has now risen. This means that quantity supplied by the domestic suppliers has increased. This means the price faced by domestic consumers has increased. This means that increase in price faced by domestic consumers means quantity demanded has decreased. This is a D, not a 0 there. Ooh, didn't want to do that. Yeah, I'll just leave it be. So what's going on here? Well, here's something very interesting. We're going to mark these as A, B, and C. I want you to pay attention to those three areas right there. All right, so quantity of imports shrinks. It was the blue, now it's the red. Domestic production increases from QS blue to QS red. That represents an increased output of domestic suppliers. This is where the argument for protecting jobs by restricting trade comes from. Right? If you restrict the number of imports by putting a tariff in place, you will get more domestic production of that good. And that's true. You just get less money spent elsewhere, and so fewer jobs everywhere else. And less growth. So you get an increased price, you get reduced imports, you get increased quantity supplied by domestic suppliers, you get reduced quantity demanded and consumed on the market as a whole. All right, now let's see here. What do sections A, B, and C mean? Well, A is increased profit. Got that? A is increased profit. C is deadweight loss. Okay, C is deadweight loss. C is wealth that would have been created at QD blue, but now is no longer being created at QD red. Right? It would have been consumer surplus, would have been wealth created by voluntary exchanges, but now it simply isn't. And so it's wealth that would have been created but isn't. That's the definition of deadweight loss, so that's what this is. Well, what is B? I'm setting it up like this for a reason. You'll see in just a bit here. In a condition of tariffs, B is tariff revenue. In other words, that is the tax revenue for the government, in this case, our federal government. And that makes perfect sense, because if the difference between the world price and the tariff price is the tariff size, and then if QS red to QD red is the number of products that are still imported, well, the tariff times the number of products imported is your tariff revenue, right? P times Q, the relevant P times the relevant Q is your revenue. So that's exactly what's going on here. So A is additional profit for the domestic suppliers. That's why domestic suppliers like tariffs or other trade restrictions. B is tariff revenue, why the government might like the trade restriction, although really only a very small percentage, like in the 3%, 4% range of U.S. federal revenue every year comes from tariffs, a very small amount. C is deadweight loss. Nobody really wants that, but nobody big and concentrated with enough concentrated interest in that deadweight loss actually screams. Labor unions, labor activists like the increase in output and therefore the increase in employment represented by the change from QS blue, QS red. Who loses? Consumers. Because now consumers go from here to here. They lose this. They also lose all of this. Right? Oh, and there's extra cost here too. It's costs that domestic manufacturers incur that they otherwise wouldn't. I'm sorry, no, it's profit that domestic manufacturers incur that they otherwise wouldn't. You know what? It's late. I messed this up. A is not increased profit. A is waste. There we go. That's better. A is waste. So go back and change your notes. And here's why. A is waste because that is below the supply curve, right? It's below the supply curve, but above the international cost curve. So it's above the international price world curve. So we know that the foreign market's willing to supply the goods at the world price. A is above that. So A can't be part of their costs. So A is extra cost incurred by American companies that aren't incurred by the rest of the world. So it's wasteful application of resources on the world scale. It's inefficient application of resources on the world scale. This red profit here, this is what domestic suppliers are looking for. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking before. But yeah, this is the right version of that. So A is waste, B is tariff revenue, C is the dead weight lost, A and C are bad, B is a transfer. Remember, as economists, we don't really care where the transfer goes. What we do care about, well, A and C, but also this increase from the world price to the tariff price. All right, this increase right here. That we care about because that reduces the money that consumers have to spend everywhere else. All right, so this is what tariffs do. Prices increase, domestic quantity supplied increases, imported quantity supplied decreases. Box B is tariff revenue for government. Now here's the fun thing. This same graph works for our next thing too. Our next one is a quota. And a quota is a limit on quantity. And so a quota being a limit on quantity simply says, well, now, instead of taxing you an additional amount to bring your cars or your toothbrushes or whatever into the country, we're going to restrict the number of cars that you can bring into the country. Same exact chart. Except now, instead of this movement being start, right? This is the first order of operation for tariffs. This restriction is the first operation for the quota. The quota comes in and says, hey, you know what? We're only going to let you bring in red QS to red QD quantity of goods. Have a nice day. But what happens is that the foreign supplier says, okay, we can only bring in that. What's that going to do to the market? And the market says, whoa, there aren't as many cars coming in from Japan now as there used to be. We're going to bid up the price. And so the price rises, and the price rises up to PT. And so with tariffs, the rise between price world and price tariffs, or PT, is determined by the size of the tariff. With quotas, the rise is determined by the horizontal, right, the horizontal quantity size of the tariff and where that interacts with the domestic supply and domestic demand curves to give you an increased price. But it looks exactly the same, except that box B, right, box B is additional revenue for that foreign supplier now. Everything else is the same. Domestic producers incur more waste. Domestic consumers see more prices. They reduce their spending on other goods. There's a deadweight loss. There are more jobs in this particular industry, although fewer elsewhere. But box B, instead of being revenue, goes to the foreign supplier. I will point out that there are tariffs that are termed voluntary export restrictions, which is basically the nice way of having a quota. Sorry, not tariffs, quotas that are voluntary export restrictions. And essentially, you go to the foreign government and say, hey, Prime Minister of Japan, it'd be really swell if you would restrict the number of cars your companies can send us. That way, then, we can continue to play nice with you in various ways. It's a quota, but by persuading the other country to voluntarily adopt it. How gentlemanly. Let's talk about regulations. Again, same thing. Use the same graph. Isn't that awesome? Except now, box B is waste. Waste by the foreign supplier. So here's what happens. Regulations work by basically telling the foreign supplier, well, to sell into the US market, you have to do X, Y, and Z. Maybe you have to get more inspections at the border than anybody else does. Inspections cost money. They also cost time. That's the big one right there. And in business, time is money. And so if your shipment has to sit an extra 3 days at the dock, then that's costing you money. Cause you to increase your prices. But nobody benefits from that. It's just waste. Or maybe we say, okay, you have to use certain materials, or you have to pay your workers a certain amount to meet up to our Western standards of what workers should be paid and how people should be treated in your manufacturing facilities. Now, all these things can be done to increase costs to the foreign manufacturer. And yeah, they bring their prices maybe more in line with our domestic prices. That's not a good thing. All right, box B up here, right here, that's now waste by the foreign supplier, waste to the foreign supplier. Okay. Now, our fourth broad category of restricting trade is subsidies, and this is different. Basically, what happens is that let's redraw this graph because it's different enough. I should do a different graph. Here's the world price. What we do is we artificially lower the supply curve. Oh, that's atrocious. Try that again. We artificially, third time's charm, right? Good. We artificially lower the supply curve from supply real to supply fake, which means that our domestic suppliers, instead of producing here, will now produce here. Yay, right? No, it's bad. It's bad because we end up paying the vertical difference between the real supply curve and the fake supply curve for every quantity sold. I mean, at the very best, we're only paying this amount. At the very best, that's the best case, and that all comes from tax revenue. See, this is the only one where the world price remains the U.S. market price. And so, yes, imports fall from here. Well, let's do it in the colors that we've been doing. All right, imports should be this. They fall to this. All right. So with the subsidized fake supply curve, the subsidy causes suppliers to increase the air supply curve. Yes, domestic production increases, but that's fake. It occurs because we are paying them with tax dollars, and that shaded area is pretty much the best case scenario. Right, that's pretty much the best case scenario. If we end up saying, okay, we're going to give you, say, $10 per unit, I mean, we're giving them $10 here too. And if we're really bad at our job, we're giving them $10 here too. Right, and so depending on how the subsidies are constricted, it could be just a mild tax payout, and that's the black and red squiggly areas, or it could be a huge tax payout, and that's all the extra red. And by tax payout, I don't mean on the corporation's taxes. No. The subsidy goes to the corporation that's paid for by you and me. It's paid for by taxpayers. So consumers of this good don't get hurt. And so people can sometimes be fooled into thinking that a subsidy is a good way to keep a domestic industry going, to protect the domestic industry from foreign competition or whatever. Yeah, no, it's just you don't see the cost because it comes through taxes. Okay. That's enough there. Now there is a case, sometimes it's called the infant industries case, which is that we subsidize to help a weak industry or a young industry grow. Problem is, historically, that never happens. Because at any point in time, let's pretend that these supply curves shift to the right. And so you end up over here eventually. Well, hey, now you're actually, well, first of all, you're exporting goods, but forget about that. You end up here, sure, you could stand on your own, right? You could stand on your own and nobody would lose their job. Say we end up at SF eventually. Problem is, though, now you've got SF2, you're still getting that subsidy. So when the subsidy ends, people are still going to lose their jobs. And that was the argument for having the subsidy in the first place. So no matter how good you get, removing the subsidy when the industry grows up, if it ever does, and historically, statistically, that's doubtful. But when the industry is strengthened to the point where it doesn't need protection anymore, you're still going to have lost jobs when you remove those subsidies. And so politicians aren't going to want to take that hit. They're not going to want to stand there and say, you know, I'm going to stand on the bridge and get rid of these jobs because the subsidy is costing us money. No, no, no. Most of the time they just say, yeah, the subsidies existed forever. We'll leave it in place. Nobody really cares. Unfortunately, they're often true. So subsidies to help a young industry grow don't work. A, usually that industry doesn't grow. In fact, statistically grows slower and is less likely to flourish than if you just leave it alone. And B, the subsidies never go away. All right, and that is it for now. So this graph here, I'll leave it here. I'll leave that right there. That graph there is the important one. And B can be tariff revenue. B can be additional profit to the foreign supplier. And B can simply be foreign supplier waste, depending on which form of trade restriction you've decided to implement. All right, thank you. See you next time.